In our last video, we looked at the different types of focal species. In conservation planning, one or two focal species are often chosen to guide conservation planning, and they are often chosen ad hoc from the millions of species of concern to conservation. In this video, we will look at the proposal to determine a suite of focal species for conservation planning through a more systematic approach that was presented in our reading by Robert Lambeck. Lambeck's framework for identifying focal species is outlined here. Let's go through each of these key steps and see how they can come together to identify a set of focal species to use in conservation planning. The first step in Lambeck's model is to distinguish those species that are vulnerable from those species whose populations are secure in the landscape of interest. Ideally, this analysis should be based on the most robust science available, based on long-term population surveys that are able to identify the trajectories of species populations. However, this type of data is difficult and often very expensive to obtain, so sometimes anecdotal observations from people familiar with the area will be the best available data. Lambeck also notes that it's better to take a precautionary approach to this step, in that if the status of a particular species is in doubt, it should remain in the analysis listed with the vulnerable species rather than with the secure. Once the vulnerable species are identified, the next step in Lambeck's model is to distinguish between those species that are in need of habitat reconstruction or restoration and those that would be able to persist in the current landscape. Species that are in need of restoration efforts are either limited by processes and are constrained by factors like the fire regime or competition from exotics, or they are limited by resources and are constrained by the amount of or access to essential resources like food or shelter. Once you know which vulnerable species are limited on the landscape and are in need of some kind of restoration effort, the next step in the model is to figure out what limits the different species of interest. Lambeck's model groups these species based on what the key threat limiting them is. For example, species that are unable to move between habitat patches are dispersal limited. There may be suitable habitat patches to support the population over the short term, but for the long-term persistence, access to more habitat is necessary. And the current landscape, this movement is just hindered by a hostile matrix. Other species will be limited by a critical resource, such as a particular food source. Species may also be area limited, in that the patches of appropriate habitat available in the landscape are too small to support a viable population over the long term. Finally, species may be limited by ecological processes, requiring certain phenomena like fires to occur within a certain range. Once species are grouped according to what limits them, focal species to be used in conservation planning can be identified by ranking the species in each category in order of their sensitivity to that threat. The most sensitive species, the ones at the top of the list, will become the focal species. Dispersal limited species, those species that are limited by their inability to move between habitat patches, should be ranked according to the minimum width, length, and structural requirements of the connecting vegetation through which they are known to move. The species with the greatest needs or the least inclination to use corridors will become the focal species. For resource-limited species, where there are a number of species utilizing the same resource base, the goal must be to increase the resource to a level that will meet the needs of its least abundant user, which will become the focal species. This ranking process may be repeated for a number of key resources in the ecosystem of interest. Area-limited species should be ranked according to the smallest habitat patch in which they are observed to occur. Whichever has the greatest area requirements, the one that requires the most amount of habitat, will become the focal species because it's assumed that any patch large enough to support it will be large enough to support individuals of all of the other species. This process will need to be repeated for all of the key habitats present in the area of interest for conservation planning. Process-limited species are ranked in terms of their vulnerability to a particular threat, with the most vulnerable becoming the focal species for that threat. Like all conservation priority setting exercises, Selecting focal species doesn't mean much if you don't act on it and turn it into action. The process we just went through will result in a list of species that are then used to determine different attributes that must be present if a landscape is to meet the needs of its most vulnerable species. The list would include focal species to define the minimum area of each patch type, species to define the minimum width, length, and structure of connecting vegetation, species to define the appropriate levels of a critical limiting resource, and species to define the minimum rate or intensity of each potentially threatening process. The needs of these focal species define the minimum requirements that must be exceeded, and these minimum requirements are then generally expressed spatially to act as an explicit guideline for management and conservation planning. It is important to remember that the process outlined here in Lambeck's model only considered proximal threats, and it is possible that management decisions could lead to changes in species composition or distribution, thereby altering species responses and potentially bringing about new threats. Because of unpredictable actions and imperfect ecological data, it is important to develop a monitoring program as part of any conservation action to assess how efforts are working and to allow for adaptive management.